Good morning. My given name is Mark Podlasley, and my ancestral name is Tasha. I'm a member of the Ntlaka'pam Nation here in British Columbia, and I am the Chief Sustainability Officer at the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. I'm speaking to you today from the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Today, the First Nations Major Projects Coalition has convened experts in clean energy generation projects to understand BC's call for power as it relates to First Nations in BC. Our panel will examine the significance of the call for power, potential opportunities, and challenges for First Nations. As the province takes decisive steps towards a cleaner economy, it is imperative that First Nations are equipped with the knowledge and tools to leverage this opportunity for economic growth, centering the benefits with First Nations. I remind you that this is your event, and to ask questions of our expert panel about BC's call for power, you can send in your questions via the Slido website at www.slido.com. Please use the code FNMPC, and we will answer as many of your questions as we have time today. Today's event is sponsored by FNMPC's sustaining partners, which include Air Canada, Arcadis IBI Group, CIBC, Synovus, Colliers Project Leaders, Kiewit, Gowlings WLG, Kiewit, New Gold, and Pattern Energy. I am honored to moderate today's panel that will include guest speakers. These are Terry Burgis, Senior Vice President, Kiewit, David Durrant, the Market Development Stakeholder Relationship Manager for Pattern Energy Group, and Katuma Cole-Sayers from Huipishasset First Nation, Executive Director, Clean Energy BC. On June 15th, earlier this year, the province of BC announced that there will be an upcoming call for power, a call for new sources of renewable, emission-free electricity to power British Columbia's clean energy and economy to meet BC Utilities Commission demand forecasts that new sources of electricity will be required sooner than previously expected. If approved by the BCUC, BC Hydro will seek approximately 3,000 gigawatts of clean energy or renewable energy from greenfields facilities in BC for commercial operation by 2029. BC Hydro may also require 700 gigawatts of new clean or renewable energy from existing facilities before 2028. The call for power is relevant to BC First Nations for several reasons. The BC Hydro Task Force is drawing on further Indigenous and external energy experts to provide strategic advice on advancing Indigenous ownership and/or equity interest opportunities. The First Nations Major Projects Coalition is currently assisting our First Nation membership in exploring equity ownership of energy and other major projects in BC and across Canada. Our service delivery places an emphasis on structuring ownership opportunities in a manner where the risks associated with ownership can be minimized and where the social and economic value of participation by First Nations as owners can be maximized. All projects resulting from this call for power, First Nations led or otherwise, will still have unspecified minimum requirements for partnership with First Nations, and this will include evaluation on this basis. BC Hydro's engagement on the call for power includes, and I quote, the development of options regarding minimal requirements for Indigenous participation in all new projects. Outside of the call for power, but complementary to it, the province of BC has announced $140 million in funding to the BC Indigenous Clean Energy Initiative in partnership with the New Relationships Trust. This funding was created to support, and I quote, smaller Indigenous-led power projects that may not otherwise be competitive due to their smaller size. This funding suggests that Indigenous equity is on the table for clean energy projects generally. The timeline for BC Hydro acquiring this new energy is as follows. This year, in June 2023, there was the announcement for the call to power. This has happened. Starting in spring 2023 to spring 2024, BC Hydro will engage with First Nations, the public, and other stakeholders. Hydro will also produce draft documentation and release for public comment sometime between October 2023 and January 2024. In spring 2024 will be the call for power. This will be issued by BC Hydro. The following year, in either spring or summer of 2025, BC Hydro will call for the submission of bids, and they will evaluate the projects and award contracts. So with that as a background, I would like to call upon our panelists to have an opening discussion. And the first question I will present to Katuma. Economic reconciliation is a priority in this call for power. In which ways can First Nations meaningfully participate in this call? And what are some of the challenges to First Nations participating in the call? Katuma.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark. Good question. What are the ways that First Nations can benefit from this call, given the timeline? I mean, we certainly have challenges, given that the short time frame, for not on the First Nations side, but also on the project side. Big projects need big timelines. So we have our work cut out for us. So collaboration, I think, is going to be key between First Nations, our industry partners, BC Hydro, and government. Now we do have these, high-level objectives, reconciliation objectives, in addition to UNDRIP obligations. Now, what exactly is that going to mean in the call so that we can ensure that we can maximize benefits to First Nations? Ideally, in a perfect world, I think First Nations would like to have more lead-up time so that we can do the early assessment work to see, what's the feasibility of realizing our community energy goals. There are infrastructure constraints that, that a lot of nations, I think, in rural areas feel that, there are reliability issues and just the capacity issue. We can't add more generation onto the lines. So there's a certain number of First Nations that won't be able to participate in this call or future calls until we have the opportunity to build new lines similar to what we're seeing in Ontario with equity ownership for First Nations, so that there's that condition of possibility for more generation in those areas. The other area that we are working through is what does it mean to benefit the communities in this call, given the reality of the timelines. And I think just to be short and to the point, I think not all equity is the same. I think we have to ensure that we can maximize the benefits to the communities and be able to have flexibility in the participation models that BC Hydro will propose so that we can evaluate project benefits to the community on a project-specific basis, and that we also hear from the community that are these benefits something that you want. But I'll keep that short there. I mean, it's such like a huge topic. It's a lot of details, but I'm happy to hear from our other panelists. And back to you, Mark.
Thank you. We will come back to this question about equity and risk. And I would remind viewers that at the slido.com website, enter your questions. FNMPC is the code. There are already 3 questions that have come in. They are on the screen there, and we welcome you to send in more. Dave, I'm going to turn to you now. Pattern Energy is already in partnership with BC Hydro. Can you tell me about that project and how it's going?
Okay. So first off, thank you very much for having us here today, Pattern Energy here today, Mark, First Nations Major Project Coalition. So I respectfully acknowledge that the land I'm on is within the unceded traditional territory of Katzie First Nations today. So that's the Pitt Meadows, Maple Ridge area, and Katzie are the traditional keepers of the land. I'd like to extend a welcome to Chief Gale, First Nations Major Project Coalition directors, the chiefs, councillors, for all the Indigenous nations that are looking in today, to panel members, Katuma, and to Terry. Ladies and gentlemen, so my name is David Durrant. I'm the Market Development and Stakeholder Relationship Manager with Pattern Energy. And Pattern Energy is one of North America's leading renewable energy companies. We develop, construct, own, and operate high-quality wind and solar generation transmission and energy storage facilities. And our mission is to transition the world to renewable energy through the sustainable development and responsible operation of facilities. with respect for the environment, communities, and cultures where we have a presence. So Pattern Energy is owned by Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, and we own one of the largest wind energy fleets in Canada. We're headquartered in the United States, and we have a global portfolio of more than 35 power facilities and transmission assets, serving various customers that provide low-cost energy to millions of consumers. So as a result of the recent BC Hydro call for power, it's imperative for Indigenous communities to forge energy partnerships with BC Hydro, which is underscored by several compelling reasons. And to get to your question, firstly, my experience operating BC's largest wind generating facility, Meikle, with a capacity of 184.5 megawatts, has highlighted BC Hydro as an exceptional partner. So BC Hydro exhibits forward-thinking perspectives, unwavering reliability, and a genuine commitment to the well-being of British Columbians, traits that extend to their partnerships with Indigenous communities. So I'd like to reiterate that the number one reason why any group would want to engage with and become a partner with BC Hydro is because BC Hydro is an exceptional partner. Secondly, forming energy partnerships empowers Indigenous communities to assert greater control over their energy resources, and this reduces their historical reliance on non-renewable fossil fuels, thereby mitigating associated environmental and health hazards. And that is what Tuma, was alluding to just a few minutes ago. Thirdly, such partnerships present valuable economic opportunities by creating employment opportunities and generating revenue for Indigenous populations, thereby fostering self-sufficiency and overall living standard improvement. And last, I would say that integrating Indigenous perspectives into renewable energy projects promotes sustainable development while respecting cultural values and traditional land management practices. So this inclusive approach fosters collaboration among Indigenous groups, government, and industry stakeholders, resulting in more responsible and respectful decision-making. So in essence, this involvement ensures that renewable energy initiatives are not merely ecologically advantageous, but also socially and economically equitable, contributing to a more just and sustainable future for all. So the benefits of Indigenous communities becoming equity stakeholders in renewable energy ventures extend well beyond immediate advantages. So economic empowerment takes center stage, and through active participation in renewable energy projects, Indigenous communities access new income streams, employment opportunities, and revenue sharing arrangements. And this economic stability alleviates poverty, enables investments in education, healthcare, infrastructure, catalyzing long-term community development. Equity ownership confers a seat at the decision-making table, enabling Indigenous communities to exert influence over project design, for instance, and operation, and thereby ensuring that projects respect their land, culture, and sovereignty. So renewable energy sources, including solar, wind, hydro, geothermal power, play a pivotal role in advancing global sustainable development goals. And Indigenous community involvement in renewable energy represents a pivotal pathway towards a sustainable and equitable future. It addresses the urgent imperative to combat climate change, bolsters energy security, drives economic growth, minimizes environmental impact, and expands energy access, and champions social justice. So embracing renewable energy is not merely a choice, it is an imperative stride towards a more sustainable and prosperous world for all. So for all of those who are with us today, if you represent an Indigenous community, if you're interested in the BC Hydro call for power, Pattern Energy may be able to assist you. So we have great experience as Mark had just said, with the existing Meikle Wind project, that we're currently have on the go. And again, if we can assist you, we'd like to. Thank you, Mark. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Dave. I would like to point out that what you described there on the different types of clean energy, the First Nations Major Projects Coalition publishes resources on exactly that topic. And if you go to our website at fnmpc.ca/resources, you'll find a number of reports there. In last year, we did a report on net zero by 2050. It was the theme of our annual conference, which had over 1,300 people come, about half Indigenous. And everything you described in there, those types of energy, are detailed in that report, and it's available for free online. Terry, I'm going to turn to you. First of all, can I ask you just to give us a quick overview of Kiewit, the company you're representing, and then also about the experience your company has working with First Nations?
Thank you, Mark. First off, I'd definitely like to say thank you to the First Nations Major Project Coalition for having me on this panel. It's always a great opportunity to get together with the other panelists here and talk about these things, and also to be able to communicate with the various First Nations who have dialed in. So I'm seeing a whole bunch of questions popping up, so that's encouraging. So as Mark said earlier, my name is Terry Burgis. I'm a Senior Vice President with Kiewit Development. Kiewit Development is the development and investment arm of Kiewit. And most of you probably think of Kiewit as a large engineering and construction company. That's true. We are typically ranked in the top 3 in terms of revenues for heavy civil construction contractors, and we work across a wide variety of different segments in the construction and design industry, from buildings, infrastructure, oil, gas, and chemicals, and of course, the energy markets. As an organization, I like to think of us as a fully integrated organization. We do everything from that early design work through construction. We also have the group that I'm in, which is a development group, which will help develop projects, potentially finance them and structure them. So we can really provide a full service offering across quite a variety of different segments. And we have extensive experience with a variety of different types of energy projects. Obviously, a number of us, particularly in the province of British Columbia, know us for our hydro experience. We've done a lot in the last call for power. We did a number of projects that were run-of-river projects. So we have a lot of experience helping develop those projects by supporting the early design of those projects, and then going out and finalizing design, building them, helping get the permits, and helping developers with those projects. We also have extensive experience with solar, wind, obviously fossil fuel type power plants, geothermal, so across a wide variety of different projects that we could support, working with a variety of First Nations. I would say that is one of the other things that Kiewit has what I believe is a good reputation is working with First Nations in actually all those sort of different areas that I mentioned. Whether it's helping to develop a project, we have, although not a power project, we do have a road project where we are an equity partner with the First Nations to develop a road that accesses their community. And on numerous projects, that project also, we typically have partnerships that we form with the local First Nations group in the area where we're building, and have success with developing people, supporting First Nations businesses in the construction of those projects. Done a number of projects across BC like that, but really across all of Canada in different areas.
Thank you, Terry. So I remind viewers that the slido.com app is open and available for questions. You'll see some of the questions that have come in already, and people are voting in on them. If you have any questions to ask our panelists about this, about what you've just heard in terms of their service offerings, or about questions that you would like to pose in reference to the call for power for British Columbia, please send them in. If we are unable to answer your questions, these are questions that are good for you to pose to BC Hydro as they do their communication sessions across the province in the coming year. Again, fnmpc@slido.com. Cole, I'm going to turn back to you for a follow-up question. There's a real sense of urgency in the call for power. Is this potentially a barrier for First Nations who wish to participate in the call?
Yeah, I think that's something that I know First Nations, that have been saying at our events, that, in order to participate meaningfully in the call and enact their clean energy priorities, that they need time. They need lead up time to do their own community engagement, their community energy plans that are formed by their membership, doing the early assessments and finding the money to do those early assessments on resource assessment, what's potential in their territory for generation, what are the constraints in their region, whether it's transmission, so a short timeline is difficult, particularly as larger projects. I've been hearing from some nations who are in those areas that are constrained by transmission line capacity. They're not going to be able to participate in this call because of the larger utility scale projects that are going to be prioritized. So there's so much diversity with First Nations interests that it's hard to speak to all of them. I think with larger projects, in this call, there could just be a few large projects that could benefit a few. And I know that this has been a concern raised by some First Nations that it's great for those nations, and we're happy for those nations that will potentially benefit. But what about the other 200 nations that aren't going to be able to participate in this call? And so that is a real issue, and there's a lot of interest to balance. And so something like having the large call, you mentioned that the 3,000 gigawatt hours, that's a good size. That's 250,000 homes, and then there's that potential 700. What the First Nation Energy Mining Council is going to propose, and what others have in the past, is a carve out or something similar. And this isn't a new model. Saskatchewan had a version of it, but I think a carve out of that energy needed could be feasible. So that could be a dedicated First Nation stream. Something reasonable like 25% of that 3,700 gigawatt hours would be very reasonable, and that could help First Nations build capacity. They can prioritize smaller projects. It could be married with that NRT, $140 million. In addition to supporting nations in the main call with the big projects, and supporting participation in those larger projects in terms of project management, and possibly supporting even a First Nations led developer. I think communities do want to think big. They do want to lead projects, so keeping that open as well. And also just focusing on partnerships. There are a lot of ways to structure partnerships, and like David said, they're one example that they have working with communities in other jurisdictions. And so this industry has certainly matured over the past 10, 20 years, and other jurisdictions have really pushed the bar in terms of what benefits are being passed on to the community. But the short timeline, is a significant challenge, and it's one that we're going to have to work through. That's why I think in this call we should build in the call benefits to the communities, and establishing minimum benefits to communities. In addition to exploring a carve out that's Indigenous led, and also having in mind subsequent calls, having BC Hydro signal to market, so that our industry partners too will want to invest here in BC. I think that's also, that is an issue that we need to address, so that our industry partners will look to this jurisdiction as an attractive place to invest. And and keep it short.
There's a lot in there. Kutuma. We'll come back to that in the discussions. As you've seen people already putting in questions and starting to upvote questions who relate to those questions about equity and about prepared and partnerships. We have time to answer those questions. Again, please, slido.com, fnmpc.ca. I'm going to turn back to Dave. Dave, Pattern Energy has a 50% equity partnership with the First Nations community of Henvey Inlet in Northern Ontario. So a question for you, how do you protect your equity partner? Is that important? And if so, for what reasons?
How do we protect our equity partner? Okay.
I'm referencing that into the fact that for a lot of First Nations, these projects are new. This is a new industry for First Nations to go into. They may not have the technical capacity to immediately participate or the capital or in terms of construction and procurement. So is there ways that, how has that happened at Henvey Inlet? How have you worked with the First Nations to have them prepare and participate actively in a 50% arrangement?
Well, I think it all starts, Mark, with, free, prior, and informed consent. Yes, we have a 50% equity partnership with Henvey Inlet, which is located in Northern Ontario on the shores of Georgian Bay. And why is protecting the equity partner important, and for what reasons? I can think of three reasons. Preserving trust and relationship, risk mitigation, sustaining value and growth. So in terms of preserving trust and relationship, trust is the cornerstone of any successful partnership. And when you protect your equity partner's interests, you demonstrate your commitment to the relationship and build trust. And this trust is essential for effective communication, collaboration, and long-term success. And if your equity partner feels that their interests are not being safeguarded, it can lead to conflicts and potential damage, and it can damage the partnership irreparably. In terms of risk mitigation, business ventures often involve various risks, such as financial, legal, or operational risks. And when you protect your equity partner, you are essentially mitigating these risks for both parties. And by ensuring that your partner's investment and contributions are secure, you reduce the chances of disputes, legal battles, or financial losses that can harm the partnership. And the third point, the sustaining value and growth. Equity partners typically bring valuable resources, expertise, as well, capital to the table. So protecting their interests helps maintain the partnership stability and ensures that both parties continue to benefit from the partnership growth and success. And when equity partners feel secure in their roles and contributions, they are most likely to remain committed, which can lead to sustainable growth and value creation. So just summing it all up, protecting your equity partner is not only a matter of ethical responsibility, but also a strategic move to maintain a healthy and trust-based partnership, mitigate risks, and sustain the value and growth of the business. So it ultimately contributes to the long-term success of the partnership and the achievement of common goals. Thank you, Mark.
Dave, thank you. And I'd just like to point out to those of you who are watching or curious about that project, it was featured at the FNMPC Industry Indigenous Engagement event last year. And that report is online at fnmpc.ca/resources. If you look to the net zero report, you'll find in the primer ahead of that conference, and in the post-conference report, a write-up about that project and what was involved for those First Nations. And we're very grateful to Henvey Inlet and to Pattern Energy for providing us that example at the last conference. Terry, I'm going to turn to you. During this discussion, and just now, we've heard about the talk of project risk. How can First Nations address risk in projects like these?
So I think one of the, and I'll expand on something that David was talking about there in terms of the the importance of being an equity partner. I think the way that the risk is mitigated and managed by the Indigenous group that is in equity is to get the right partners. And I know that's easier said than done, but I think to our project that I mentioned earlier, which is a P3 road project in the Northwest Territories, where we're equity partners with the Tlicho First Nation on that. And we are partners in terms of our exposure to equity risk, and it's all the things that David was touching on there. Whether it's financial risk, whether it's some failure of a component, don't clear the snow, whatever. It's a little different than utility risk, but we're both exposed to it, and our alignment is that we are both in equity. We're both partners, and we, like any partnership, whether you're in the equity participation or whether it's a construction partner, that alignment of interest, and everyone brings strengths and weaknesses. So we bring obviously a lot of experience doing equity investments, managing operations and maintenance of projects like this, the construction aspects, and the local First Nations, the Tlicho, bring all the local experience. They're providing local resources, the things that we need for a project to be successful in their community in a remote location like that. Is really all that local experience, local knowledge, supporting permitting, supporting the development, assisting with conversations with the government. We're true partners. So I would say one of the most important things that when I think of in terms of having an equity partner and equity risk is getting the right partner, and really when I think of that project, it's benefited both parties equally, and they're a great partner, and they give us a lot of insight into the local, getting things done in the local community, also in the local permitting areas and all that. So I think find yourself the right partner would be what I would say, and that takes a little time. Just while I'm talking, I did want to touch back on something that Kwatuma also mentioned in terms of the relatively short period of time in advance for this call for power, and just to expand on that. I mean, as he was talking, something I was thinking was, if you have a project that you're looking at in your community and it might not be ready for this call for power, I think it would be, my recommendation would be, try and advance your projects, because it's not uncommon for things like this to happen where funding comes available, whether it's for an opportunity like this call for power or something else, on relatively short notice. And typically the projects that are more advanced and have actually gone through some of those initial development phases are more likely to get to get the opportunity to move forward. So, I mean, I agree it may be a little discouraging that there's not enough time for some of the projects that many of your communities may be looking at, but I would say don't be discouraged in terms of continue to develop those projects and continue to work on it. And one of the things I would say is I mean, I know the challenge can be finding funding for those for everyone, but continue to look for funding sources, continue to develop those projects would be what I would suggest.
Thank you, Terry. So again, as this is your call, we are up on slido.com, FNMPC for questions. We're going to turn to the questions that we have now. Some of you have upvoted some of the questions that are on screen right there. But please send in more. This is your opportunity to ask our panel questions you have in relation to the BC Hydro call for power. But in addition, perhaps there's questions you have about a operation or potential, as Terry pointed out, for the future that you would like to have questions raised. Now, we will take your questions, answer them if we can. This is also an opportunity for you as BC First Nations to have a discussion among yourselves to see what other First Nations are thinking about, and that perhaps the question you have for your First Nation is something another First Nation is also thinking about. This would be a good way to find out. I'm going to start on the questions at the number 1, which is at the top there from Mr. Joe Bevan. Previous BC Hydro energy purchasing program penalized northern electricity projects by discounting electricity purchase rates by 25%. This makes northern projects uneconomic. Has this new call for power changed this, or will it be changed? This is a question I'm going to direct to Kotuma in your role, if you can answer that. It is not my understanding that this is addressed in the call for power, but I will direct this to you if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, first of all, I don't have the answer for you. I think that would be better directed at BC Hydro to answer. I think that their answer might be that they will be releasing information on constraints and benefits on their grid. So First Nations can use that information to then do further assessment work. I think the North Coast is a very interesting region. I think that's where a lot of new demand is going to be in terms of industrial customers. So I would say to Northern First Nations along the Northwest Line. I know that there is some talks around following the Hydro 1 50% Indigenous equity option around First Nations ownership of twinning the lines up there. And as well as I know that, I think there's some interesting work too on Indigenous utilities in terms of owning generation and transmission, whether that's, in transmission system that's being proposed, or something that's more edge of the lines, edge of the system, where you're connecting an industrial project to the grid and owning that line. So I think then Indigenous utilities could just be, a regulatory or governance vehicle to facilitate that. In addition to advocating for wheeling opportunities and having unscheduled access to the lines to be able to facilitate, greater access to market. Those types of things are going to need time to develop. Especially if there's going to be subsequent calls, and we'll know, what size those will be and where the demand will likely be, and where they'll likely need power. I think once we have that information, we'll be able to have a bit more lead up time for subsequent calls. And just to point to Terry's very important comment that it might be hard for a lot of nations to participate in this call, but I would recommend not to give up on your project. Find the right partner, as Terry said, and really try to find funding to fund those projects that you want in your community, because I think that there'll be more opportunities down the line.
Gentlemen, I don't know if you have comments on this, Terry or Dave. Any input or questions you'd like to make a comment? We heard from Kotuma that this is a question that might best be answered by BC Hydro in their consultation and discussions with First Nations that's going on right now. Do you have any input on this? Any comments?
Terry, if you wouldn't mind, if I could go first. I haven't heard anything about rates being discounted at all by BC Hydro. I know that BC Hydro is is extending themselves to the Indigenous groups within the province. They're looking at a number of different factors to ensure that that the bid is competitive. So I believe that the BC Hydro, and having worked with BC Hydro, I believe that their will is to the good, and that I think that we should just stay tuned. So I am far more on the positive side in terms of working with BC Hydro, and maybe we could flesh out a little bit more about what competitive bid means. We could ask BC Hydro that question, but I haven't heard anything about the PPA rates being reduced for northern communities at all. Thank you.
Terry, do you have any comments?
I was going to say the same. I haven't heard anything about discounting rates for any of the projects. I mean, there is, and as pointed out in the document that the First Nations Major Project Coalition circulated, there's a preference for certain types of projects, but I haven't heard about any discounting or penalizing one project over another. But Hydro is stating where they want a certain size, they want something close to an existing transmission line. So those things exist, but I hadn't heard anything about particularly discounting rates.
All right. Well, thank you. Again, I would remind viewers, slido.com, FNMPC is the code. And if you have questions, please send them in. You'll see the current questions we have here, and we will work through these through this morning's session. The next question there, in other provinces, First Nations own equity in electric utilities. Where can we find out more about these examples? Again, Kotuma, I'm going back to you because your role representing a First Nations focus. Do you have information about where viewers can go for that information?
Electric utilities. Yeah, the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, I think, did a study that's found on their website that listed, I think, 60 project examples. But there's examples in Manitoba and Hydro One in Ontario where there's First Nations ownership into generation and transmission, respectively. But happy to connect by email to forward more information on more examples or to discuss further.
Well, thank you. You mentioned the report that FNMPC has produced. Yes, there is a report. There's two of them actually on Indigenous ownership in electric infrastructure. And they're on the fnmpc.ca/resources tab. They're at the bottom. It was the first report that the coalition had put out. And as you heard, there is a report there that notes 60 Indigenous and local ownership models around the world. They are Indigenous as well, very focused on Indigenous. The second report focuses on a hypothetical case of an Indigenous project in British Columbia. And it gets detailed right down to the point where power lines, the pylons would be located, the sharing formulas between First Nations on a linear project. So I encourage you to go to that site. I'm going to come back here for a moment to Dave. Dave, because Pattern Energy has had involvement with First Nations, where can they find more information about the projects that your company has been involved with First Nations?
Well, they could, I think the best route to get a hold of me, I mean, they could contact me directly, Mark, at David Durrant at patternenergy.com, go through First Nations Major Project Coalition, and I'll make myself available for any group at any time.
And Terry, the same question to you. I know that Kiewit has been involved in the past with First Nations in infrastructure like this. Where can they go for more information about those projects?
Yes, although like I mentioned earlier, we might not have an equity partner in an electric utility we have in other infrastructure projects, and by all means you can reach out to me. That's terry.burgess@kiewit.com, and I can kind of always happy to talk to people. Love talking about Kiewit projects and where we can work and partner. So you can always reach out to me. I would say, and both Kwatuma and Mark touched on them. I mean, I think the First Nations Major Project Coalition is also a good association for this group to leverage and reach out to and get more information. There's some great information they've already pulled together, so I would encourage you also to reach out to the First Nations Major Project Coalition. They're always going to be helpful and also be able to direct you to other industry participants such as Kiewit, or whoever they think is appropriate, so they can help direct your questions and answer it or point you to the right people, I think.
Great, thank you. I'll move to a question here from James Delorme. Good morning, Mr. Delorme. Are any outstanding standing offer program projects that were shelved when BC Hydro moved to Site C priorities, will those become a priority? Kwatuma, you're going to have the lion's share of these questions, I believe, but we'll start with you on this question about the standing offer program projects that were shelved. Is this addressed in this call for power, or is there information you can provide on that?
Probably not any new information that has been presented by BC Hydro. I think if there are any projects that were shelved on the standing offer program, that those who have fit their current criteria of this call will be competitive. But I think the standing offer program had a cap on project size, and if there are utility scale projects, I think a lot of the standing off programs at the time were Run a River in the Southwest, and those will have a hard time being competitive with other technologies at scale. Again, I think that question is probably better directed to BC Hydro so that they can answer that. But to answer your question, it depends. Sorry for the non-answer.
No, some of these questions are more appropriately directed towards BC Hydro. These are excellent questions. And it's good that First Nation viewers here, the communities and nations watching, understand that these are questions that other nations will have as well. So please, we will answer what we can. We will also on the FNMPC website in future have additional reports and discussions, and these questions will inform those papers and reports as they come forward. The next question here is about the Malahat Nation. It says here that they're interested in providing load balancing services to the BC Hydro grid on southern Vancouver Island. Would a BESS project fit within the criteria of this call for power? Kutuma.
Yeah,
I'll buy you lunch afterwards because I'm putting so much pressure on you, that's one, but this is yours.
No, I'm happy to answer these questions, at least to the best of my ability. And, again, not to pass it out to BC Hydro to answer, but I think to date, the battery energy storage is not included in this call. But I do think that First Nations ought to lobby government and BC Hydro to include battery energy storage in the future, if not in this call, because there are opportunities for, as Malahat says, in certain regions where utility scale battery storage could be very strategic in balancing the loads. Six Nations has a really good example with their utility scale project, and there's some there are companies that are based in Vancouver like Convened or Moment that uses repurposed recycled EV batteries, that could be deployed whether it's in remote communities helping displace diesel or for at the grid scale purpose. And I think that is an opportunity for First Nations to own that infrastructure, but it needs to be identified as a priority by First Nations so that we can include it. And I would recommend, that Malahat comes to the Vancouver session tomorrow at BC Hydro. I'll be there, and it'll be really good to hear that from the communities, because I think that is a really good, really good tech, really good opportunity for First Nations, and I think it will be helpful within incorporating battery energy storage into our grid.
So the project that you referred to in Six Nations is the largest battery energy storage projects in the country, and it is co-owned it's a joint venture between Six Nations, First Nation and Ontario, and will be servicing Southern Ontario, and is a huge success. We profiled that at the Coalition at our annual conference. It's also written up in the conference reports if you want more information about the technical aspects of that. There's also information there about their partners who were very instrumental in putting that forward. I should point out that in other parts of the country, First Nations are moving into the battery energy storage systems, and it is a good fit for many nations, and they've decided that that's the route they want to go with partners. I will refer you again, fnmpc.ca/resources. Take a look at the Net Zero report, and you'll see about those battery energy storage systems. I'll move to the next question here from Mr. Kazimel. Will BC Hydro be giving weight in the decision-making to Indigenous-led projects? Will BC Hydro be giving wind projects preferences? There's two questions in there. I'm going to give Kutuma a bit of a break. I'll split this. I won't give it all to you, Kutuma, but I'm going to start. Is BC Hydro giving weight in the decision-making to Indigenous-led projects? Just that half of the question.
Is that to me?
Yep, that's to you. And the second half's going to Dave. So Dave, get ready.
I think that, well, I don't want to speak for BC Hydro, but I think my understanding is that, that hasn't been decided. And but I think that is a priority, and they're trying to canvass from First Nations how they would like to be incorporated into. What type of evaluation criteria should be included, and so with what I said earlier with both the call and a potential carve out, there is potential there to set the criteria. but what that criteria is, is what matters. So Indigenous led, what does that mean? Is it a majority owned? But if it's a large utility scale project, and and if a nation can't participate to a great extent, will that project not be considered Indigenous led? So there's a lot of it really depends on what type of projects we're going to see, project size, access to capital, community interest. But certainly, I think there are. But I think across, I think the main point is that Indigenous-led projects or Indigenous participation to a greater extent will be valued to in some way. But how that'll look like hasn't been determined yet.
So I would also review viewers, the Indigenous Clean Energy has a number of, they profile different Indigenous-led projects, or at least Indigenous-involved projects on their website. And if you Google it, Indigenous Clean Energy, you'll come up with a map showing the different locations of those projects across the country. Again, the power of comparative examples is huge. What other First Nations done in this case? Who are their partners? How have they structured themselves? How have they reached agreement with their local BC Hydro type utilities? That's all available online. As I promised, Dave, you get the second half of this. Will BC Hydro be giving wind projects preference?
I don't work for, well, of course, I don't work for BC Hydro. And so I can't really answer, that question. I know that BC Hydro, again, is that this is a competitive bid process, that they will be looking at a number of different factors. And I know that one of the factors has to do with Indigenous involvement. So whether it's wind or solar or geothermal, again, that will be a decision that BC Hydro will make, and they'll make that based on a competitive process. So, at Pattern Energy, we are a renewable energy company. So, we are in both wind and solar, and we think that we're a terrific partner, and we hope that if there is an Indigenous community who would like to participate in this call for power, the BC Hydro call for power, that they would consider Pattern, and we could sit down and have a discussion.
Terry, I'm going to ask you a question on this, and I know it's not specifically wind, but you did mention that Kiewit has had different projects you've partnered with First Nations on and different infrastructure formats. Can you talk a bit about the energy focus that Kiewit has had? Is there something you'd like to say to First Nations, since there's about 200 individuals on this call right now, about Kiewit's work in that space?
Certainly. I mean, as you mentioned, although we have not been kind of an equity partner on energy projects, we have extensive experience across, like I was talking about earlier, a wide range of different energy projects. So if you're looking for someone to talk to about, call it, we have a lot of in-house design engineers, so to support early design development or development of your project. Obviously, we're happy to participate and support projects in the earlier phases, talk to you about them. We do have the development arm that I work in, so for the right opportunity, we may participate as a development partner, or we can help because we do have the relationships across the industry to support finding development partners for you. And then obviously we are a big construction firm, so if you've got a project that's more well advanced, or you already have a development partner, or you already have a designer, and you're looking for someone to be a good partner to work with you to build that project, that is certainly, we do all of those things. So, and we've worked in all those kind of roles with different First Nations. Like when I think, again, referring back to, and I'll keep referring back to the Talicho all season row, because I actually sit on the board of that project, so I'm quite familiar with it. But I think on that project, that relationship expanded from, yes, we're equity partners, we're construction partners during the construction period, and then we worked together to with the Talicho to find the funding, do the design, and build a fiber optics line, which was subsequently run along the side of the road. So that was a separate project that we basically helped take from early development phase, put together, supporting the business plan, the funding plan to help get the funds from the appropriate government entities, and then ultimately we helped build it. That asset is, we are not an equity partner in it. It is owned completely by the Tlicho. So yeah, I would say we're a full service offering, and we definitely like to have long-term relationships with our First Nations partners, whether it's just in construction, whether it's also construction equity, and like I said, trying to make projects happen and develop them. So we do all those.
All right, thank you. So the next question here is we're going to expand on your answer there, Terry, and I'm going to also split this question with Dave. Is what would a good priority for First Nations be to focus on, in your opinion? Now, I understand, Mr. DeLorme, this is a very broad question. Every First Nation is different. Every situation and region is different. But as you put it here, is it a business plan, environmental study, investment strategy, economic ownership, partnerships, and industry, or all of the above? I suspect the answer will be all of the above, depending on the time, depending on the situation. So how about this? Dave, I'll turn to you. Can you talk about how, to the best of your ability, how did the First Nation of Henvey Inlet start on this project and the initiation of it? Did they have an idea? Or do any of those pieces fit? I'm going to ask the same question to Dave on sort of the all-season road. How did they start? How did the First Nation begin in those situations?
I think it started out as a result of Henvey Inlet looking for a partner that they could work with, and they found that partner in Pattern Energy, and they, we worked through the environmental, we worked through, we had Frank Davis was the Canada head, on the project, and I would say that what is of paramount importance, for any First Nations group, and is what Terry had mentioned, is finding that right partner. And I would say that it was those initial discussions that were of paramount importance for Henvey Inlet and Pattern Energy, and they realized that they could work together. And then they advanced through each stage of that of the development process. So I'll just go back to the to those very, very initial free, prior, and informed consent. There was a trust that was built between Pattern Energy and the Henvey Inlet First Nations, and as a result of that trust, they were able to move forward on all fronts.
Terry, is there anything you can share on the projects that your company has worked with? Was there a plan from the First Nation? Was there a partnership? How did they initiate this process? Or maybe it was your company that initiated it.
So, I mean, I'll sort of, I guess I'll go back to the two examples that I've been doing, which I know are not electrical examples, but I think they're good examples because they show how First Nations can work with the private sector and government in any infrastructure project. And so the road project I think of first. So that would be a project where I think what made that project successful was the government of the Northwest Territories was really committed to the project. Obviously, the local First Nations also wanted the project to happen. So there was a lot of upfront consultation, work, and communication between the government and the local First Nations. So I think good engagement early, because let's be honest, a lot of these infrastructure projects will require some level of government funding, and that certainly is a government of the Northwest Territories project. So some good foresight by the government of the Northwest Territories, early engagement to come up with a plan, and find out and listen to the First Nations that they wanted our equity participation, and finding ways to structure a procurement and a process that allowed for that, and also giving thought to the local abilities as it relates to construction participation, is either in their businesses or in providing employees and staff, and then into the operations and maintenance. So I think that was important there, is good early engagement and listening and communications really helped that project to get it off on the right foot. And then when I think of the fiber project, it's a little different, because there was a project where there was a need that definitely the Tlicho wanted fiber, like a fiber network connection to the community that the road connected. Government of the Northwest Territories wanted it, but then they needed a help from a development partner like ourselves to kind of figure out how to put all the pieces together and help in the middle. So that, again, a lot of early communications and conversations. I think the other thing, so when I look to the question, what's a good priority to focus on in your opinion? Like, I think what your projects are. It's that part of the first step is engagement with who do you need to help you develop it, and all these other things will fall out of it, business plans, environmental studies. But I think your first step, whether it's finding a developer partner, whether it's engaging with, on a power project, BC Hydro, whether it's another kind of project, the appropriate government entity that can hopefully bring some funding to the table to help fund all these other things, because they all cost money, right? So things to get your first kind of step forward to developing all these things, coming up with some sort of feasibility study. So I don't know if that answers the question. A lot of different things there, but.
Thank you. And Kotuma, do you have any input on this? Would you have you come across priorities that First Nations have been focusing on first, second, or third?
Not. I think it just depends. There's so much to consider. Whether the First Nation is just starting out and they're looking at just developing a community energy plan and identifying what the community's priorities are. Maybe they don't want to do generation. Maybe they want to do DSM with installing heat pumps and improving the envelope of on reserve homes, or doing early resource assessments on seeing what the potential is in their territories, and then they can use that to leverage other government grants to do more detailed engineering or environmental assessment work. But some nations have already had that work done, and then we're just so close to submitting to the SOP, 10, 12, I mean, how long ago was it? Like 15 years ago. So they have those projects in mind. Like Terry said, like some nations might already know what the potential is. They've done that early work. They can step ahead into those and put money into doing any sort of updating on those feasibility studies, and then they can move more into like the business arrangements and that sort of thing, because these things cost money and it's hard to find what grants or putting up their own cash to do these things. So there is some strategic some strategy that needs to go towards where we should put our priority is. So it really depends on where the community is at.
That's a great question, Mr. Delorme. And again, back to fnmpc.ca resources, you'll find how First Nations there have driven their projects and gotten them off the ground. I should just point out, at this year's conference, we had a First Nation from Australia come. It was the Mirning First Nation, and they are they initiated a 62 gigawatt green hydrogen facility. When complete, it will have 3,000 wind turbines, 25 million solar panels. What was outstanding about their presentation was that they had started finding a partnership. That's where they went first, and then everything flowed out of that, exactly as Terry had mentioned. So every First Nation is different, but again, comparative examples. Check with other First Nations on projects, see where they started, and see if you can replicate that in your nation when you're looking at projects. I'm going to move to the next question from Tla'amin Nation up on the coast here, Mr. Virtue. It says here, can First Nations access the new relationship trust funding to invest in existing clean energy infrastructure operating in their territory? Example, can they use that funding to purchase an equity stake? I am not directly familiar with what the requirements on that funding is. I believe it's $140 million. The New Relationship Trust would be the best place to go to ask that question. You can find them online. And I don't know if any of our panelists have any input on that. Again, Kwatuma, have you heard of anything like this? What can that funding be used for?
Today, I think government hasn't decided how they're going to use that funding. I think that there was a presentation by NRT that 140, the BCI CEI funding would operate, status quo for the next several years. That is supporting largely feasibility stage activities, and then use the full amount over several years to support projects. I'm assuming covering capital costs, but there's a lot of uncertainty because if that 140 is meant to support equity positions, and if there are only a few utility scale projects, that 140 doesn't go very far. So for example, 100, 200 megawatt wind farm or something, or 300, you're getting closer to $1 billion. So that 140, itself could just support equity positions for one First Nations and one project. But in terms of smaller projects, I don't think that they have decided that yet. So I think that would be a good discussion for the First Nations to direct to both the New Relationship Trust and to the Ministry of Energy, Mines, Low Carbon Innovation, that they explore how they could use that funding to support equity stakes into not only new projects but existing assets.
All right, thank you. The next question here says, for lenders, the ability to service debt in the utility sector is often reliant on stable offtake agreements. I wonder how this can be structured within equity sharing JVs. So this is a natural question to present to you, Dave. I don't know if you can speak to this in terms of your company already having a project, an agreement with a First Nation. Can you address this?
It's a difficult question to address. Equity partnerships, and answering this type of a question. I mean, these are confidential JVs, or typically confidential agreements that are between companies, and I think that's probably the best place to leave them. But I don't think that I can really answer this question right now, Mark. Maybe it can go back to Cole. I know that I've entered into many JVs, but I wonder how it can be structured with equity sharing with JVs. I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. But what I could do is certainly get our Canada head in and and try to break this out a little bit more, for the individual asking the question, and hopefully find some answers for either him or her.
Yes, please go ahead, Terry.
I'm just thinking it, kind of breaking it down. The first part of this question, I absolutely agree. You definitely need a reliable, stable offtake agreement. The counterparty for the offtake agreements here is obviously BC Hydro, which we're talking about. So that is very financeable, shall we put it that way? So when you have that offtake agreement, and can it be structured with equity sharing joint ventures? I would think so, because of the type of projects we're talking about here: stable offtake agreements, strong counterparty. You can almost certainly structure around it, regardless of the equity arrangement between. Now, my experience has been the equity arrangement with the First Nations is they are a full equity partner, so it's actually pretty straightforward if that's the structure you have, being alongside a development partner. So this is, as long as you have what's set out in that first part of the sentence, with the right counterparty taken off, I don't see it as being an issue. Typically, it just depends on how much equity you might have to put in to give the lenders the protection they're looking for. So
we would point out the coalition at our conferences, this question has come up several times, and as you heard from David, many of these JV agreements are confidential. So it is not clear at times exactly the answer to the question. It depends, it depends, it depends. But if you look at our website again under the resources tab, there is an example there of a gas-fired cogeneration facility that has 5 First Nations and an equity stake. There is some information in there. Again, the best place to go if you can is to approach a First Nation who has been in a situation like this to say, well, how did they structure their examples? The coalition is very interested in these questions and very interested in trying to provide these answers. As you heard, they are confidential, but we will do our best to provide that information to nations who are interested in pursuing this. So please follow the coalition. You can contact the coalition if you have specific questions as well, and we will direct you to where information might be available. And that would be at ceo@fnmpc.ca. But please, this is an excellent question, and we will provide the information the best that we can. This is also something that a question may be directed toward BC Hydro in their consultation sessions, just because it is of interest to First Nations, and if not for this call to power, then future call to powers about the offtake agreements. The next question here from Patrick Marshall. We are a startup marine tidal energy business. We have a demonstration and tech verification location and have invited nations to observe before buying. We offer 100% ownership to individual First Nations. How do we connect? I would direct you to, again, the coalition. We have 144 members across this country, from coast to coast to coast. And in many cases, the nations you're looking to connect are probably somehow affiliated with the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. So again, reach out. We will do our best to put you in touch. For those companies and proponents and project promoters who are looking to do projects, the coalition would be welcome. We would welcome contacts to say, well, is there something here of benefit to First Nations? The mission of the coalition is to advance self-determination decisions by First Nations and better environmental and economic outcomes. So by all means. We have not focused on marine tidal in the net zero report because at that time there were no projects in British Columbia of the scale to be included, and that was approximately 18 months ago, but we know this is changing rapidly. So please reach out to the coalition. We will do our best to put you in contact with interested First Nations. The next question here, how should interested parties go about partnering with Indigenous communities to bid on an IPP? We have 2 companies with us today. So I'm going to just give you each an opportunity to address this. You're an interested party. You want to partner with Indigenous community. How would you go about that? I'll start with you, Dave. How did you go about it?
If an interested party is interested in partnering with Pattern Energy, we would like you to reach out to First Nations Major Project Coalition. They have all of our contact information, and we would be happy to sit down with you and go over your project. We would, we are a renewable energy company, and we support Indigenous participation, Indigenous equity participation, and so please, go through First Nations Major Project Coalition, or you can contact me directly at daviddurrant.com@patternenergy.com. Thank you.
Terry, in your projects, I don't know if you were involved at the beginning to start them out, but how did Kiewit go about partnering with First Nations? Did you have to reach out to the nations, or was it the other way, nations reaching out to your company?
Typically, it's been a combination of both, but quite often for us, it's us reaching out. We see an opportunity in a local community, whether, and like I said, I'm not just talking about power projects. It could be a road project, could be a mining project, where we see and are aware of the project, and then we would reach out to the local First Nations community. And what I would say is we've been in the industry for a long time, working with different Indigenous groups. So we will often, we're fortunate in that often it's us picking up the phone and with someone we've partnered and worked with in the past, or even leveraging a past relationship. But I think it's about, and like I said, we are lucky. We've been doing this for a while, so we have relationships. But there also are, and I'm going to plug the First Nations Major Project Coalition here again. There's you can use this forum, the coalition to help you with some of those things. I think if you don't have existing relationships, but I would say a lot of it is building relationships, looking at where there are opportunities, and then just taking calls on occasion, but quite often it's being proactive and reaching out to First Nations.
So I'd like to add to that, reaching out to First Nations. As a member of a First Nation, many times project proponents seem afraid to contact us. Not all nations are wanting projects, but for those who do want partners, it would be a welcome outreach done respectfully to a First Nation to find out if there's interest. Because many times these project proponents will not approach First Nations. They'll go first to the regulator, or they'll go to the markets first. And that is just not on for First Nations in the 21st century. So contact the First Nations. You also heard you can contact the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. We'd be happy to make the introduction for your project to those First Nations that are relevant and agreed. And if they're members of the coalition, even better. If they're not members of the coalition, we can certainly inform you of how you should approach them. So please, again, the coalition. I'm watching the time here. We're not going to be able to get all of these questions. So I'm going to speed up here a bit. You're voting. This is awesome. You're voting questions up as I'm trying to read them. That just flashed before my eyes. What sources of competitive capital in terms of cost and repayment options do you envision for the First Nations to have? What First Nations have for funding these equity stakes acquisitions? What would you say is the main challenges of the process? I can speak to that. From the coalition, we have heard over and over and over from our member nations, it's that access to competitively priced capital. Nations can access capital, but again, the main barrier to that is the Indian Act. We do not own our assets outright. They're held in trust by the Crown for our use. That's a huge problem. And we have seen examples across this country of nations who've had the opportunity to acquire equity, but have not been able to raise the capital. Of all the issues we deal with in the coalition, this is probably the #1 issue because it goes across the spectrum from energy projects to transportation projects to critical mining projects. It's that access to capital. So what we are looking at is trying to find better mechanisms for that. We have been massive advocates of a federal loan guarantee program that would allow First Nations competitive price capital to co-invest with this private sector in projects. That exists in some provinces in this country. It exists in Ontario and Alberta and now in Saskatchewan. And each of those provinces has a different format of how they're doing it, but you can find those things online. In Ontario, it's the Aboriginal Loan Guarantee Program. You can Google it, it'll come up. In Alberta, it's the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation. In Saskatchewan, the program is the newest one. You can find that by Googling it online. I'm not aware of the name of that program, but those are the programs that we strongly suggest be put in place in provinces like British Columbia. One thing to point out, these are not free money. What it is allowing Indigenous people access to the capital markets that all Canadians have access to. It's just that we can't because of the historical realities of this country. Again, the reference on the documents or the resources tab on the coalition shows how some nations have overcome that. Each case is different. Some cases it's a deal with the provincial government, and other cases it's deal with the project proponent. Every case is different, but you have hit the nail on the head. It's access to competitively priced capital. So again, the website, resources, coalition. How should interested parties go about partnering with, I believe we talked about this, to bid on an IPP. So I'm going to reference this. Interested parties are partnering with Indigenous communities. We've already talked about this. What you're starting to see is this IPP movement already starting to happen across the country. Indigenous Clean Energy, Google it, it'll come up. You'll see about how nations have structured their agreements with First Nations and partners. That's the best place to go for information on that. Indigenous Clean Energy, fabulous website. I'm moving through this quickly because we're running out of time. This is awesome. And again, this is not going to be the only time we've done this at the coalition. We regularly have sessions like this to answer First Nations questions. Mr. Marshall, I believe there is a bias towards mega projects. Nations do not have to sell into BC Hydro grid. Don't discount replacing diesel by BC Hydro. Is there a voice for small developments? That's a huge question. There's 3 questions. Kutuma, is there a voice for small developments?
Well, in this call, with larger projects being, prioritized, it will be harder for small developments to be competitive. That is to say that they're not going to be, competitive, but it would certainly be challenging. And so that's why, I'm proposing a carve out of some of the 3,700 gigawatt hours of energy required. That way, this carve out could be, a reasonable size, and then we'd have the opportunity to set different priorities that would allow for the smaller projects to be feasible. And I think that jives with the government's rationale for the 140 million at the NRT to support projects that may not be as competitive as others. So again, I do want to put that notion out there of a carve out that could help facilitate those smaller projects and help realize those community goals that can come from those small projects and the smaller developers that could benefit from that.
Again, this is an excellent question to ask BC Hydro at their consultation sessions with your First Nation. Many nations will share this concern. Please raise it in the sessions when they occur. The next question, and there's two of them here that address on hydrogen. At least there were two. Yes, there are two that's on hydrogen. So in terms of hydrogen coming up as a new priority as energy source, and this is fascinating because this was a focus of the Western Australia example we had at our conference earlier this year. I'm going to combine the two questions. What realistic steps can Indigenous communities take to begin preparing for hydrogen participation? And the next question is about combined hydrogen systems. Again, the resources that may be offered to finance this. Hydrogen is not in the call for power at this point. Hydrogen is emerging as a possible new energy source for Canada for domestic use and export. There are projects around the world right now, partnerships with Indigenous people coming forward. The Western Australia one at 62 gigawatts is the grand example that we brought forward, but there are other places it's happening. Rather than focus specifically on hydrogen, I'm going to ask our two industry reps here again to repeat what they said earlier about how do you prepare for future projects? I know you already talked about this. Terry, I'll start with you about how a nation can prepare for what's coming next. Could you just repeat that and how nations can get ready for this possible new wave?
Yeah, I think, well, one, if you have an opportunity and you're aware of and working on it, continue to advance it. But I think it's that in engagement with government, with development partners, anyone who can help you advance these projects, I think would be a good first step with that. And obviously talking to people who are in that industry and doing hydrogen type projects, have those conversations early and engage and see if you can find a partner to work with on some of your ideas.
Dave, anything to add to that?
Well, we are involved in a project in the port of Argentia right now and in Newfoundland. It's a hydrogen wind project. It is again a very exciting project, and where numerous partners are currently involved, as are the Indigenous community as well. But as Terry said, it's very, very important to engage people early on in the discussion, engage all of the different partners. One of the things that I think is very, very important, is again free, prior, and informed consent. Signing memorandums of understanding, are very, very beneficial for all parties because there's clarification of intentions and expectations. You're formalizing a commitment, in an MOU. You're establishing a framework for future collaboration. So, again, I think if you're entering into a project, even if it's not an immediate project, it's just prudent to undertake certain steps that clarify intentions, again, formalize commitment, and provide this a foundation for future collaboration.
Right. Watching the time, there's 2 questions left here, and this is excellent. You've given us some excellent questions. Again, this is not the end of this discussion. Please bring these up to BC Hydro in your discussions with them. We will, at the First Nations Projects Coalition, be doing events like this regularly, so we will address them as well as possible. And for those First Nations who are going to those sessions, speak to neighboring nations. Your questions are held by other First Nations as well, and that there's great learning to be doing, talking to each other. So this is to Kwetuma, and I believe the answer is no. How can this initiative support First Nations involvement in existing power purchase arrangements? Forgive me if I'm wrong on this. I do not believe this has anything to do with this certain call to power about existing PPA, power purchase agreement renewals or amendments, does it?
No.
No. Yeah, that's an easy answer. No, it does not. Another question here, again, watching the time. General preemptive steps that a non-Indigenous government can take in supporting their Indigenous neighboring communities and achieving their energy goals. I can tell you again, which we repeated earlier, the number one issue that we hear at the Coalition all the time is access to competitively priced capital. If there is a project that is feasible for a First Nation to meet its energy goals, most of the time it is the access to capital to make that work. There just isn't enough funding available, generally through government programs or through directed contributions. So again, for a community who has a viable energy solution, it is again the access to capital. I would again refer you to Indigenous clean energy. Google it and they will come up. You'll see what neighboring communities, you'll see what Indigenous communities are doing to meet energy security needs, which is interesting. In some of those cases, those community projects are providing energy to the non-Indigenous communities. There's a project that we are very proud of at the Coalition in Fort Nelson, which is a geothermal plant proposed, 15 megawatts. It would provide power from an Indigenous project to the non-Indigenous community. And that is something that is good for the entire economy. So again, access to capital. Your answer, you know what, you're giving great questions, 3 minutes to go. I'm reading them through here. We're not going to get to all of these. I'll try and, you're going to have, here it is, Kiewit, outstanding partner. You're going to have to refer that to Terry. He's given you his email address or contact the Coalition. I do not have time to get to the rest of these questions, but can you please contact, well, the last one, where you can find funding of Indigenous-led equity project. Look at that. Fantastic questions. 2 minutes to go. Please contact us at the Coalition, ceo@fnmpc.ca. We'll provide the answers to these as best we can, and if we can't, we will direct you to those parties that can. So I want to thank you all for joining us today for this important discussion. I want to thank Terry, Cole, Kwetuma, and Dave for their contributions. And finally, I want to thank you, and a thank you to our sustaining partners for sponsoring today's event. If you have any further questions like these, comments like these, or feedback, please reach out to us at the FNMPC at ceo@fnmpc.ca. Finally, to close today's event, I am very excited to announce that our new conference website is now live, and registration for FNMPC's April 2024 conference, which is titled Our Collective Advantage, Indigenous Consent, is now open. Please visit us at conference.fnmpc.ca to learn more and take advantage of early bird ticket pricing. Thank you for joining us this morning. Cooks Chem, I wish you a good day.